ventured into cattle and hired cattle hunters in Kamehameha and Waimea. Oh, and I remember his ranch that ran along the Waikoloa stream was called Pu'uloa. Yes, I know some of you know it as the Parker Ranch home, but it was my husband's. And I know some of you women will understand me when I say that as successful as my husband may have been, he was not always the easiest person to live with. But I can recall one night in particular in 1839 when the Sandwich Islands were having problems with France that I felt as though he had dumped the future of these islands in my hands alone. And for you to understand how I felt that night, I should start at the beginning, which was January 31st, 1837. The chiefs had set a new law for the citizens' guidance. It prohibited the teaching of the Catholic religion or the landing of Catholic missionaries throughout the Sandwich Islands. And naturally, my husband and I knew it was the Protestant mission behind this law. You see, the Catholics had been here long before the law had been set. Two priests by the name of Bachelot and Short had landed in these islands and had been so diligent in their teachings, they had managed to convert a few followers. Not to mention, they were also welcomed and defended by the Royal Oahu Governor Boki, as he himself had been baptized a Catholic in 1819 by Captain Louis de Fassanier. And truth be told, the Catholics were no threat to the mission or the king's rule. However, Kuhina Nui Kahumanu had the Catholics forced from the islands, and then after her death in 1832, Alexis Bachelot planned another mission to these islands. He felt as though Kamehameha III would be more tolerant. However, when he arrived in 1837, he was met with a much more stern greeting than he had originally anticipated. Armed guards met him as he disembarked his ship and forced him back aboard, where he remained confined for several months under the watchful eyes of the chiefs. And naturally, my husband and I knew it was the Protestant mission that was behind this lack of common hospitality. My husband and his friends didn't have a very high opinion of the mission. My husband's personal opinion of their leader, Reverend Bingham, he was lazy and arrogant and prickly. But I remember when he and his friend Mr. Reynolds discovered that the mission board had limited Bingham's funding to such a small amount that it seemed very likely many of the families were going to be sent home. It was Levi Chamberlain, along with Reverend Bingham, that suggested it would be more than appropriate for the chiefs to aid them monetarily. I remember the way Mr. Reynolds guffawed that night at dinner. The lazy louts. Some of them were mechanics, the rest of them farmers. Let them go back to their former occupations. And then a great clamor drew my husband and Mr. Reynolds down to the fort. Two Catholic women had been imprisoned, and as Mr. French retold the scene to me, he shivered. One of the women had large chains around her ankles and a pair of patent handcuffs around her wrists, and she had been stretched over a low shack, the eaves of the shack as high as her neck, and it had rained the night before. The eaves drippings running down her neck, and the next day the sun was hot upon her before 9 o'clock. And the other poor woman was chained below a small tree. Her hands reached as high as they could go, tied to the bottom limbs of that tree. Both of them had been left that way for 24 hours, without food or water, unable to sit or stoop. They were at the the mercy of nature's calling where they stood. And it was a Mr. William Hooper, a principal for Ladd & Company, and a friend to the mission, who went to Reverend Bingham and begged him to intervene on behalf of these poor tortured souls, and Bingham refused him outright. He said that if Mr. Hooper had inquired further, he'd see that the women were arrested for breaking the law. And naturally, it was only a matter of time before Mr. French and Mr. Hooper could stand this injustice no longer, for it was religious persecution. They went down to the fort, freed the women, and marched them up the hill to Governor Kekuano'o's house. As they marched through the town, citizens left their homes in droves to stand witness to the spectacle that would happen outside the governor's house. The governor scoffed at my husband's pleas. It's not fair for me to paint him as a villain. He was just a fool, under the spell of the rabble of Reverend Bingham. The governor asked the people what they would have him do, and it was my husband that bravely spoke up, saying that he was only looking for the right path. To which the governor gestured to the road that led back to the fort and said, "Go home and mind the selling of your goods. Leave the Catholics to me." The air was thick with tension as the citizens waited for my husband's response. And he said it should be used better before turning on his heel and taking the women back. Of course, it wasn't long before Reverend Bingham's moral crusade affected more than just the Catholics. But it was January 1839 that the chiefs had set a new law regarding liquor and distilled spirits. It became illegal to import rum, brandy, gin, wine, and alcoholic drink of any sort to any of the ports throughout all the islands. And you can imagine my husband and his friends' shock as they all owned stores and grog shops. Soon the liquor law became a scandal. Captains met with Reverend Bingham for hours, begging him to relent, which he would not. The missionary villains used the law to their advantage. They now controlled everything that came in and out of all of our ports. If something wasn't done soon and drastically, many foreign businesses would have failed. While this was going on, word spread throughout the South Pacific of Reverend Bingham's religious persecution of the Catholics. And then in May of 1839, we women heard our men discussing a French victory over the Mexican government in Santa Cruz. Apparently, the Mexican government had decided not to protect French citizens in the country and had allowed drunk soldiers to sack and burn a French bake shop. Naturally, France responded by sending a battalion armed with 400 cannons into the country and did not withdraw them until the Mexican government paid the equivalent of 3 million francs, along with the assurance and apology that nothing like this would ever happen again, and all French citizens and their properties would thenceforth be protected. I don't know how the missionaries felt, or the chiefs, when they found out that it was Commodore Laplace who had just recently confronted the Queen of Tahiti for her religious persecution of Catholics. Nor do I know how they felt when we all discovered the Commodore was headed our way. But I do remember the hush that fell over the town as we saw the Commodore's ship enter our harbor. There was the newly arrived Councillor Dubois, Councillor for the French, who went out to meet the captain on his frigate, the Artémise. And there he stayed for several hours before returning with 3 French soldiers. Upon his return, he delivered letters to the American consular, the missionary consular, and the king's representative. And in these letters, he outlined his purpose for being in the islands. He had come seeking reparations for the wrongs done towards France and her children. He had also come to express the demands of the country, of which there were 4. The first, any Catholics that had been imprisoned for religious reasoning would be set free immediately. The second, the Catholic religion would be allowed to be practiced throughout the Sandwich Islands. The third, a site would be set aside on which a Catholic church would be built. And the fourth, the king of the Sandwich Islands would give to the Commodore for France $20,000 as an apology and a promise that no longer would the Catholics or France's children be persecuted. The Commodore was businesslike and polite in his letter, however, his words held a dire threat. He expressed that France was the most powerful country in the world and that there was no country capable of stopping her from exacting revenge on those that had wronged her and her children. And if the king did not agree to the demands, well, France would declare open war on the Sandwich Islands. So after much deliberation, the king decided to agree. However, the $20,000 would be a little hard to guarantee. You see, the government didn't have $20,000, and the king was more than hesitant to give this information to the Commodore, for if he could not produce a mere $20,000, how could he protect his kingdom from one of the greatest powers in the world? And so it was the governor who went to the foreign citizens and asked for their help to raise the money quickly and quietly. It was men like Hiram Grimes, Mr. Brewer, Mr. Reynolds, who gave whatever they could spare. The missionaries also found a way to give $1,000, and the governor came to my husband, and despite their past differences, my husband also donated $500. And so it went until the money was completely raised and delivered to the Commodore. And then to add insult to injury, the Commodore then decided he wanted a commercial treaty, which would ensure that all French goods, particularly brandy and wine, could be sold throughout the islands with no more than a 5% duty. The next day, the king in full uniform, along with Governor Ho'opili, Captain John Meeks, and Reverend William Richards, boarded the Artémise and left shortly after to a 21-gun salute as the treaty had been ratified. With the French having their demands met, they'd be leaving the islands in 2 days' time. And with my husband, being who he is, he could simply not let this happen until he made some wonderful business connections. Well, I remember that day, just after dusk, he came in, sweating, rubbing the back of his neck, and I asked him whatever was the matter. And then he revealed the damage he had done. Apparently, he had invited the Commodore, along with the Captain Fauchon and several Frenchmen, to dine with us the following evening, along with several of his closest friends and business colleagues. And as he paced back and forth talking about succulent ham and delicious turkey and fine desserts, I can't remember ever being quite so mad at my husband. And so the next day, as my husband paced back and forth still, down several glasses of wine to calm his nerves, and thanked me some 47 times for some many different reasons, I realized seeing him, a nervous wretch, would be punishment enough. That wasn't until we received a telegram from the Commodore saying that he had decided to see the Pali by horseback and had been caught in a torrential downpour and therefore would be unable to attend the dinner that night. All that effort, and the man couldn't even bother to show up. And so, at 4 o'clock, it was Captain Fauchon and his men that we had the pleasure of entertaining. And they ate and drank for what felt like an eternity. I swear every time I came to the table and put a plate down, when I turned and turned back, it was empty. And finally, at around 10 o'clock, they left to return to the Artémise. They congratulated me on a fine job done and a wonderful meal, and I closed the door on them. And I collapsed in my husband's favorite armchair, and I wondered whether or not I would ever rise again. And so it went. The French had their demands met, Reverend Bingham had been put in his place, and the Catholics had been given another lot on life. And my husband had made a few wonderful business connections. And what did I have? I suppose the eternal gratitude and love of my husband will do for now. So please eat, drink, God knows there's enough, and I'm going to go check on the next course. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.